listening to the 14th Source for all geek and nerdy news and discussion, which means that you're listening to a podcast.
For all intents and purposes.
I'm Dee Bethel.
And I'm Andrew Asplund.
And we are your two overeducated, codependent nerd hosts, bringing you the things that we like to talk about, but filtered through inquisitive and critical lenses in the episode for Friday, May 19th, 2023.
This is unique week. Unique week, Dan.
Unique week? Oh no, is this a new segment? Welcome to Unique Week.
No, this is just... Normally we do this show, we've been doing this show for a while, and normally every now and then is when you come on and say, God, I'm just so swamped with school. I'm so swamped with class. And finally, after what is almost 10 years, I get to come on and say I'm so swamped with school as an instructor, because as of last Thursday, I'm now teaching 2 classes at my local university along with my day job.
Congratulations. Welcome to the stress nightmares. It's going to be great.
I mentioned this because we used to always say, when we started this, it was a podcast by a lawyer and a professor, and we now just get to say a lawyer, a professor, and a professor, and a comic book artist.
Right.
We're just going to keep adding jobs, so it sounds like there's actually 10 people here.
Right. It's a large operation. One of the fun things I like to tell students is, like, you ever have those dreams? I had them too, like, as a student, where you're like, oh, there's a class I forgot to go to all semester, or like any number of those kind of like student-based dreams. I'm like, okay, I finally graduated. I'm not getting any more degrees. Those dreams will finally go away. Except they just became teacher dreams now, where it's like, now I have a dream where I forgot to teach a class I was assigned all semester long, and fun stuff like that. It's great. It's great.
I actually right now, it's because one of the classes I had to take over. So I did, for context, without saying too much, I had to take over a class that the previous instructor, 2 classes, he basically had an emergency and had to stop teaching for the rest of the year. And they're like, Andrew, I always like to joke that the department went through the Rolodex of all the people that could teach the class, and they're like, oh, I'm too busy. Oh, I'm too busy. I'm too busy. And
they went in reverse alphabetical order?
Well, no, then they got to the end, they're like, shit, we used up the Rolodex. Someone's like, what about the second shelf of the car, the names we don't go to,
They just went to the staff roster.
And those people were all busy too. And then they got to me. No, it really is one of those things where it's like, which is, I've always wanted to, this is something I've always wanted to do. I did do it briefly when I was in the web development. I was teaching web development, 2-3 years ago.
Then you developed all the webs and you're like, my job is done.
They're done. So I was done teaching. There's nothing more to teach. The web has been developed. But yeah.
So it's your fault.
But yeah, I was definitely catching someone else's incomplete course is not my ideal state to break into a new thing. But anyway, here I am. So that's exciting. So I haven't really had a lot of time for things.
Which is, I'm glad we actually kind of accidentally pre-planned this week's episode. Because no extra homework had to get done. Well, sorry to bring up homework. Sorry to bring it up. Hey, I'm in it right now too. I'm grading final projects. It's been brain melting. So we're in the same boat. Hopefully, dear listeners, this conversation makes sense. Might as well start making sense at some point.
Yeah.
After almost 10 years in this gig.
So it's a good thing we'd already talked about what we were going to talk about, which was a new movie that came out that's now on home video. Actually, I'm going to start. We all know we're talking about Dungeons and Grandmas, and I want to go ahead and start by being frustrated at the
Honor among abuelas.
Honor among abuelas. Honor among abuelas.
There we go.
The frustration that it shows up on my Apple TV saying, hey, you can buy this, you can rent it for $20 or buy it for $25. I'm like, whoa, that's not a deal to rent. So I'll just buy it. And that's great. And then a week later, it's like, it's on Paramount Plus now. And I'm like, God damn it. I mean, I don't mind paying for full price for films and stuff. I mean, it's not like I went to the theater, but just the idea that I bought it with the assumption that it was going to be the only way to watch it for like a month or two. And it was all of a week.
Right? Like Everything Everywhere All at Once is still available for rent or purchase only, but like rental is still like $16. I'm like, what? I'm used to my like $3 rentals on Amazon. Like, I'm ready for that. Or streaming somewhere. So I've been patient with a movie I really want to see. But actually, there's another movie that's in the same position, and it's been like a year or two since that movie came out, and it's called The Green Knight, that I really want to see, but like the rental prices are like exorbitant. I'm like, come on, just make the plunge. But you know what? I'm not going to harsh anybody for trying to make a buck. As you have proven, it works.
It works.
So
it works.
So Watsy got your money, and
Hasbro got my money. The fucking Pinkertons got my money. Which really makes it all feel better. Yeah.
So next time they raid someone, the Pinkerton.
Like, I paid for 30 minutes of that time.
Yeah. Sponsored by Andrew.
Ooh. Yeah. So, but we here to talk about the Dungeons and Dragons movie, and something I think we talked about the trailer before. I think I poo-pooed it before.
Yeah, I don't remember us being negative, or you particularly being negative on it. I think you pointed out, like, oh, yeah, they're definitely leaning into the Dungeons and Dragons of it all. Meaning, it's less about the characters and story, and more like, look at that thing! You recognize that thing!
Right. And that's something I definitely want to get to today. I want to take some time on. But let's talk about Dungeons and Dragons Honor Among Thieves. Yeah, let's do it. Spin it down, or play it up, or break it down.
Out.
Bop it.
Skip it. Bop it. Twist it. I will say this, so like, as I briefly talked about it before, that I had seen it in the theaters with a friend of the show, Kyron Silva of Taurus Comics, tauruscomics.com. We went in... we did say, it's like, why are we going to go see this? Because neither of us play Dungeons & Dragons. Neither of us really have a history with Dungeons & Dragons. Maybe it's just because we both have podcasts about nerdy and geeky shit. So we went and saw it, and well, I know the real reason we went and saw it is also I forgot to like unsubscribe from my Cinemark like movie appreciation membership during the entirety of the pandemic. So I've got like 6 million free movies to free movie tickets to use. So
are they really free though?
At this point, and I can't cancel the membership because they'll all expire within 6 months. I'm like, I cannot see 37 movies in 6 months. I'm sorry, but we went and saw it, and the thing that I will say is this, and I think this speaks to the surprising success of the film in terms of box office. We are two people that don't have a particular love or history with the property, and walked out of it having a good time. It was a fun movie for non-Dungeons and Dragons fans, and I can't imagine, especially for maybe a certain kind of fan, that it's a movie that really worked for, because not only is it a fun adventure film, but it also is pulling from a game that you, as a fan, I'm not speaking to you, Andrew, but that type of fan, know intimately or are familiar with. I'm just saying, I guess I was surprised that it worked as a fun movie on a level to attract people like me, or to get enjoyment from people like me who don't have any particular affinity to the property.
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely a good point. I mean, I think it sits in that space of silly fantasy action film. Or adventure film, which I think there's, what I'd probably say is that the idea of fantasy films, and it's even silly fantasy films or fantasy stories, are definitely much more like acceptable to just general audiences than I feel like they were. Not that I'm defending the 2000 Dungeons and Dragons film, but I just think that like we live in a time where any sort of fantasy whatever movie is already, audiences are primed better for it than they were.
Interesting, because I would say like it's an anomaly, because fantasy has been so redefined since you would say Lord of the Rings, but that led into Game of Thrones, right? But like Lord of the Rings, especially after the first one, it got real like hard fantasy, real serious, really self-serious, really dramatic and melodramatic, and then Game of Thrones, that's all it was. I think I want to say that fantasy in pop culture tends to mean like serious, dramatic, and epic. And I didn't know that there was a place for silly fantasy. And this is something we've actually talked about with things like Willow tried, and it failed in a lot of ways. But like, I think I said this when I talked about on the show. Like this hit that tone that I think Willow was going for in a much better fashion, in a more successful fashion than Willow did.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that looking back, with all due respect, Willow.
We're talking about the show.
Yeah, the show just wasn't that great. I mean, I liked it, but it wasn't great. Here's what I'd say is that I think. You're right. A lot of the big fantasy, Lord of the Rings, the Lord of the Rings TV show, the Lord of the Rings whatever, Game of Thrones, the other Game of Thrones TV show, the whatever. Right. They're all very serious. But here's the thing. When Game of Thrones was blowing up HBO, right? When people were like coming to work to talk about what something Lannister was doing to whatever, right? Like, I mean, moms and dads, average folks
living together.
They were coming to work to talk about the Red Wedding, right? So the idea that just like fantasy has a place where like it's not. I can imagine when we were younger, the idea of fantasy was like, I'm not into that, right? Like that's for nerds, or that's just not something everyone clicks with. But now it's just so permeated that the idea that it's fantasy, that's not even remotely a barrier. And so the idea that, it's a silly fantasy is like, okay, cool, right? Like, sure, that's a nice change of pace. It's not murder and rape every 30 minutes.
Right. Taking into account also the success of things like Critical Role and all those spinoffs and stuff like that, right?
Which is another thing where, like, people are watching Critical Role that don't play Dungeons & Dragons, which is infinitely bizarre to me. But hey, So I think that's something about the success of it that like it is. There's just a place where people are more accepting of it. I mean, I think in a way that they weren't 20 years ago. I think things like Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones and everything else has just really made a place where this movie could shine. And to be in their defense, they didn't. This is not a bad movie, right? They really. It's a solid film that like had it not had Dungeons and Dragons on it, I think it would have been just just as reasonably successful. Like I actually don't think the Dungeons and Dragons got it nearly as far as maybe it went as far as they wanted it to. Right, it didn't go too far, because if it goes too far, if it's too in the weeds. But no, I do think that we are in a time where that kind of stuff is just more acceptable. And here's the comparison I'd make is after Star Wars came out, you see a whole bunch of weird space opera and sci-fi shit just start slamming the theaters, right? And you see, like, there's a bunch of bizarre movies from the 80s that are just like
the original Battlestar.
Well, no, I mean, because I think the TV show was already out when Star Wars came out, if I recall. But just the idea that like suddenly there's a lot of weird movies I've seen, like with all sorts of actors being in these sci-fi films, that I feel like that was the kind of thing where they got the idea that we can start making these more prominently because there was just this big success, And that's what I'm saying. Whereas I feel like prior to that, like in the 60s, that kind of stuff was more niche, That's my take, and that's why I think that even though you're right, a lot of the popular fantasy stuff is very serious. It's more the idea that as a genre, we're all there for it. And the fact that this was the exact opposite of serious was probably actually better for it, because we're like, we don't need another Game of fucking Thrones, right? At least that's my quick thought there.
I mean, the only thing it was missing was I want my MTV. Like the end of fucking Willow when they're fucking playing Money for Nothing.
Right. I was like, where is this going? Oh yeah, well yeah. Let's go ahead and say it that Willow made a lot of choices that are, as the kids like to say, sus.
I was going to say the academic term is bad.
So I think that's where this movie didn't do that, right? They didn't do that.
Dangerously close in a lot of ways. Like, you could see a lot of ways that this movie could go wrong. And maybe in the eyes of some people did, right? Because it is silly.
Well, I mean, I've actually seen comments from, God, was it Jim fucking Ward again? Man, sorry. Former TSR employee Jim Ward, who's basically just, I'm sorry, he's kind of a mean person. Like, he always has a bad take nowadays. It's like, it's kind of like, okay, guy, no one cares what you think anymore. We get it. You worked on D&D in the 80s, but your ideas are bad. He had some hot fucking take about how it was a fine movie, but they really missed what D&D was about. And he had some whole commentary I was reading. And he complained they should have hired him as a consultant to make it more authentic or some shit like that.
I mean, if they should have hired anybody, it should have been Ed Greenwood, right?
And actually, though, they did hire someone because they hired someone. I forget, and he's credited in the film. But the whole thing is he actually died, I think 6 months ago. So his wife came on and basically said, in more polite terms, "Fuck you, Jim Ward. My husband did consult on this." The idea was that they didn't necessarily want the thing that you're suggesting they should have done, you know? So there were definitely people that complained. There were definitely people out there stroking their mile-long beards complaining about how this is an authentic D&D. But that's okay. I think you make a good point. Ed Greenwood. So who is Ed Greenwood? For those who don't know, Ed Greenwood he's a fella who is the creator of the Forgotten Realms. And for context, according to all the stories and the discussion is the Forgotten Realms was a fantasy world he had created kind of loosely in his kind of own storytelling, telling stories to his kids. That then when he was working as a contractor for TSR, he basically started writing content like adventures and stuff about this fantasy setting that he had in his head. And eventually TSR was like, great, we would buy that. And they did. Or at least that, you know, so that's why Ed Greenwood is basically the creator of the world that this movie was set in. Although you wouldn't know that in the movie because, you know, this was based on Dungeons and Dragons, a fully created thing of Hasbro, right? which the one of the off-putting credits was like Dungeons and Dragons as created by Hasbro, and you're like, has who?
I think you meant to say as owned by Hasbro.
Right. But yeah, so the Forgotten Realms, and actually I will say Ed Greenwood technically was it was sort of name dropped in the film.
Oh, the name is just like character?
Yeah. The fact they absolutely did, because he's ostensibly the grandfather of one of the characters in. The
wizard kid.
Yeah, the sorcerer Simon Aron, I believe his name was Almar. Almar. Mm-hmm. He mentioned his great grandfather Elminster Almar, who is Elminster, which is basically the persona that Ed Greenwood kind of. It's not his self-insertion, but it is his self-insertion.
So we know you have a tenuous history with Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah.
The question I wanted to ask was like understanding, accepting your problems with WotC and Wizards of the Coast, the publisher of Dungeons and Dragons. The question I wanted to ask, but I don't think it's actually a good question, is what would you want from a Dungeons and Dragons movie versus what we got? But I think you brought it up earlier. Let's kind of compare briefly what this movie does against, if you remember, that 2000 movie. Because that's one of the questions I did write down in my notes, which is like, why is this a better Dungeons and Dragons movie than that 2000 movie starring Jeremy Irons?
Jeremy Irons and the dude from Lois and Clark. And
one of the Wayans
brothers. But I quite seriously,
think it's Marlon? Let me check. Actually, I have it open in a tab here. Yes, it's Marlon.
It's Marlon. Okay, yeah. Justin Whalen was the one I was thinking of, who'd played Jimmy in Lois and Clark. I will say that I think what I think about with this movie, and when comparing it to maybe that movie and other things, and actually, I think the reason I complained about this movie when the trailer came out was the trailer had a lot of the vibe of the original D&D movie, which was, here's a bunch of things from D&D that you'll recognize. Not a story, not places, not people, but things, right? The original, I remember distinctly, the trailer had a beholder in it, and then the trailer for this movie had a displacer beast and a gelatinous cube. It was see the things that are the iconic, the soulless icons of the Dungeons and Dragons brand. And I think that's really what the original D&D movie, that's all it was. It was just, and then when you go to see it, right, it was a new fantasy world that was not interesting, and was kind of like, it was like someone said, like, well, look, it's called Dungeons and it's called Dragons, so we have to have those two things in the movie, which this movie did too, but that's all the other movie did, you know?
Thick
and
dragon.
it also did them in a bit of a more serious way, right? I know, hard to think with Marlon Wayans in a film, but where I think this movie also respected the fact that it could be silly, and used sometimes the silly to its advantage. And yeah, so I think that's the biggest, the thing they have in common to me was that they both tried to market on that, you know, here's the things you recognize, right?
So it says like the old movie, not only was that the marketing tact, that was actually the tact for the actual narrative. Like, look at all this stuff. How do you think this movie, the new movie, fared in terms of balancing that stuff against an actual story they're trying to tell and characters who have arcs and whatnot?
So that's actually the interesting thing for me. And, you know, as I said, my complaint was that first trailer was just look at the D&D monsters. And then for that to basically be 2 minutes of the movie.
Right.
And that's it, right? Whereas, in contrast, the movie not mentioning that it was set in the Forgotten Realms, that it's centered in the city of Neverwinter, that it features kind of stuff that's focused around, which, and I say that because, you know, the novels used to be the bread and butter of TSR, right? People read the books, they cared about the characters and stuff. I, weirdly enough, didn't, but...
Is that where Drizzt comes from?
Dr. ZZT? Yeah, he comes from a novel.
Yeah.
Yeah. The idea that was never mentioned in that first trailer, right? You wouldn't know. If you only saw that trailer, it was like, oh, another bullshit fantasy film. Whereas there was some kind of some connection. So for me, is watching it as someone who, although I don't have a big fondness for the Forgotten Realms, I ran a game for years that was not only set in the Forgotten Realms, it was set partially in the city of Neverwinter.
Oh, yeah.
So there were elements of the movie where it's like, oh wow, it's like there was a certain amount of, you know, actually I was talking to my current Pathfinder group, of which at least two of the players were in my old Dungeons and Dragons game, and I was like, yeah, and you know, at the end where they featured Lord Neverember, and well, like that, one of my players was like, oh, good old Daggalt Neverember, like, yeah, like this is a character we kind of understood, and we're like, oh yeah, and there he is, a bit older, but like, although clearly not the way that he was portrayed in my game, but you know, and of course it was just a little thing at the end. He wasn't a speaking character, but that's that kind of connectivity there was definitely something for me that I did understand and I did appreciate, but it wasn't that iconic stuff like the monsters and the you know, the things on the tin. It was the kind of the little things, and there were other little things too, right? Like talking about some of the backstory and like the Lich King Zaz-Tam. I'm like, yeah, Zaz-Tam, who was also kind of the villain of my game, right? Literally in my game, he was trying to conquer Neverwinter. So I'm like, oh yeah, here he is back again, right? So that was the kind of part that for me, I think what I actually liked watching the movie, other than the fact they did a good job, was that like I had some I guess, you know, headcanon connectivity. But again, that I would not have known.
Yeah.
None of that would have, because that wasn't, I didn't see that in any of the trailers. It was kind of like, oh, like, what's, you know, why you keeping that secret from me? And then you're showing me a gelatinous cube, which is on my, you know, top 5 list of stupidest shit in D&D, you know. So
it was a pleasant surprise, it sounded like, watching the movie.
For me, yeah. Mm-hmm. It definitely was. And I will say that the silliness to it, the fact that it wasn't, you know, super serious McSerious story, had a certain amount of like, at times, like, was it one of my friends who also has played a lot of role-playing games said like the entire scene in the graveyard felt like something that we would have done. They
rolled lots of ones in that scene.
Or just kind of that gag of like, yeah, no, we're really bad at this, you know, whatever. yeah. Right. Which is a thing that I appreciated. I know not everyone does, you know. I actually saw a meme just this week of someone that has like the picture of the Lord of the Rings saying, this is how me and my friends play D&D. And then a picture of like some clowny fantasy shit. Like, this is how other people play. This is how everyone plays it now. And I'm like, yes. Like, yes, this is what most of us are doing.
Are you saying there's even gatekeepers in tabletop role playing?
Oh, the original gate. Yeah. But so I would say I actually liked a lot of the things they did with it. Was it a perfect film? No. I mean, I could sit and, nitpick here or there, or just, certain parts of it where like, there's this idea that you get to the end and you're like, or not the end, but near the end and you're like, wait, so was the first like 50% of this movie a waste of time? Like when you're like, oh, well, all the things you tried to do didn't matter. But again, they're playing D&D, so of course.
Right. In terms of characters and stuff, obviously there's Edgin the Bard.
Man, that joke, they killed it for us by actually pronouncing his name differently than you'd think by reading it.
I think I said this last week, or as the first time I said the name out loud, I'm like, oh yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. Yep. Okay. I feel a little shame, but not really. I guess one of the questions I had was, I feel like generally, they were playing their characters earnestly. But then, like, there's two characters that really, like, stood out like sore thumbs to me. I don't even know if it's in a bad way. Mm-hmm. But there's the Paladin dude. Mm-hmm. And Hugh Grant. Who I'm like... But every time he's on screen, I'm like, he does not know why he's here.
Which is not atypical for Hugh Grant.
I know, right? Well, it's funny, like, just to go on Hugh Grant for a bit, when we saw it in theaters, before the movie started, there was this, like, short, like, sequence that they showed. That I'm sure was not in the home release. Because of what it was. It was the cast sitting on stools, talking to the theater goers, going like, hey, we just want to thank you for actually coming to the theaters to see this movie. And, like, we put a lot of heart and soul into it, and we think you're really going to enjoy it, but it's because you come to movies that makes movies like Dungeons and Dragons successful. We can keep doing it. And, like, the entire time, Hugh Grant is on the right side of the screen, not saying anything. He's just like, they're paying me to be here. It's in my contract. And the only thing he says during the opening sequence is at the very end, he's like, please enjoy the film. And I'm like, wow, this guy...
He's the Jeremy Irons of this Dungeons and Dragons film.
Not just because he's British, but...
no, because if you watch some of the special features of that original film, Jeremy Irons has scenes where he's just like, what the fuck am I doing here?
But then again, I think there are scenes that Hugh Grant is used very well in, of being that duplicitous, kind of manipulative scumbag, which is basically most roles he plays. But, like, the sort of more dramatic roles, scenes where he's, like, manipulating, his ward, for lack of a better word. And the opening scene, or the second opening scene, like, where it's a flashback of him on this cart escaping some sort of caper, like, oh, he's going to be sore in the morning, isn't he? Like, he's like, I didn't sign up for this shit. That being said, I didn't feel like by the end of it that he ruined the movie. I think of all the characters to have him play, they had him, if he had to play a character, they chose the best one for him.
Yeah. No, I actually thought he did fine. He definitely had the energy that you described, which is the guy who's definitely there for the paycheck. But it's okay because he's kind of a villain, so it's okay for him to be off from the rest of the team.
The character that I felt was like explicitly the comedic relief was that Paladin, right? The Zank, I think his name was. The guy from Bridgerton. Like, I think it all sums up when he leaves, his role in the movie is done, they're on a beach, and he's just like, I'm going to walk home now, or whatever, and he turns around, and he just starts walking. And I think they make a joke, like, he's not even going to go around a rock that's on the beach, he just steps over it. And if you watch the rest of the scene, he's still just walking straight. That, combined with his demeanor in the film, was just so bizarre. That kind of felt like a weird in-joke. Like, is this a joke that people have about paladins?
Yeah, I think so. It's, well, because the paladin is a I mean, there's a lot of backstory about how it's the kind of character that is often played obnoxiously by players because it's always written as very austere, and you have to you can't have treasure, and you have to do whatever, and you can't, and so it's this weird thing that. Although I think that it's changing as we kind of move forward, but it has that history of being that is the person that's playing the paladin in a way that's actually obnoxious at the table. So you're like, come on, guy, we need to go do the thing. Can you stop being a stupid paladin? Right.
right. Any characters that kind of stood out for you that you found particularly interesting, annoying, or cool?
The hardest thing for me is probably, I would say, just relating to it, because I've, in the sense that the way when I played D&D, which the last time I played D&D was actually a decade ago. Wow, sounds weird to say that out loud. Part of it's just the way that some of things like that paladin, the way they kind of played it, or even characters I liked. I thought Simon was an interesting character, but it's like, that's not. They're doing a brand of sorcerer that I find irritating. Like there's ways I would have preferred to see something else, or actually whatever the hell Edgin's been doing. Right, he's supposed to be a bard, but like, which again, the problem is that in the game they have spell casting powers and other stuff which you don't see, which they didn't do, which is fine. He's literally a bard, not a character class bard.
Well, is that like weird, like bard, like knight class in the game? What were they called? Sorry, it was like
the Harpers.
Yeah,
he's Harper is an organization which, so I can't talk about 5th edition because I don't know. I know, like in 3rd edition, if you go way back, the idea that like they're, sorry people who don't care about this, you have different classes that are like your base classes, for which the bard was one of them. You start out as a bard. Eventually, you may be able to pick the special class that is the Harper agent, which gives you other different cool abilities. But the bard is something that kind of behaves in a way that is sort of, this is how bards behave. I guess technically he did do one. Oh no, the magic was not. Was it his, or was it Simon's spell that was the illusion?
Oh, that was.
Did they specify whose illusion that was?
Because it started like it started glitching out, right?
Yeah, it started glitching out. But either way, so I think that's the one thing that was, Edgin was the one that kind of like, it's like the guy who says he wants to play a bard, but then he makes a rogue. right? And he's like, I'm a rogue with an instrument. Like, okay. He's like, I'm a bard. Like, no, you're a rogue with an instrument, which is fine. I mean, that's the one thing about the game, is that depending on how much of an asshole your game master isn't, right. You can be flexible, right? You can say, I am this, but we're going to play it like that. So we just assume this is actually, and they already made this comment when the whole owlbear controversy. Where the whole idea is like, well, no, this is a thing where the GM let them do that. And so we're just okay with that.
Like I said, I feel like the movie did a pretty good job of not needing viewers to know much about the lore, especially about the Forgotten Realms. They give you the context that you need to know everything. But there's one thing that, and it doesn't even matter. But now I have King Tabletop Nerd in front of me here. I can ask you, because I've asked other people and they were like, maybe not, but that weird like spell tool that Simon had on his belt where he's like cycling through different, I don't know, magic beads or some shit, was that a thing, or is that
no idea what that is?
It was cool. I liked it.
We actually that was actually, at least I have no idea. So when I watched it, that was something we like, what the hell is that? Is that supposed to be some sort of like, and it may be that, that's actually a burp, but
a burp, you say?
Oh, and I look, I just Googled this on the wiki, and it says that's actually his spell component pouch. Naturally. So the idea that, some of his spells require, Eyes of Newt or, whatever, and that's how he apparently gets it out, except it's some weird mechanical one, because, just having a fucking pouch is too much. So yeah, I don't really know. I think that was something that they just decided to do. It really felt like they wanted that to be something else, but maybe they never really, cause they didn't lean into it that hard. Cause I felt like it was something they emphasized early, but then by the end of it, I felt like they too had forgotten he had that.
Right. And was it Chekhov's spell pouch? What?
Chekhov's spell pouch. I don't know. That was definitely a weird thing. So I don't know what to tell you about that.
Seemed to do well enough. I think they're talking sequels and stuff.
Well, this is one of those things where who knows how this kind of stuff works, right? The classic adage of like, well, it has to make more than this amount, plus marketing, whatever. It's box office plus this amount, or it's budget plus this amount has to be less than the box office for it to be successful. I'm going to say, like, I don't know if any of these rules apply anymore, because one of the things I suspect that this movie is really about is secondary and tertiary effects, right? The idea that people are going to see that movie and go buy more D&D tchotchkes, or I'll tell you, Fat Dragon, like people are excited to get Fat Dragon figures.
That's
right?
pretty great.
And that right there, just being able to sell, like, here's the thing. I don't know if they made, okay, I use this term loosely. In Dungeons and Dragons, we have miniatures, right? Little figurines, but then they make massive miniatures, right? Like for hey, your little 1-inch guy, when he's fighting the big dragon is 2 feet tall, right? So I suspect there's a giant plastic fat dragon that they've either made or are making that's going to cost easily $150, $200. And people are going to buy that shit and unfurl it at their tabletop, right? Here's Fat Dragon. And that kind of stuff. That is right. That's a sale thing. That's a revenue stream that because they make these other big minis and other novelty items, but now they have a whole series of novelty items that people are going to buy because hey, they love that Fat Dragon. So yeah, so I think that's the reason why I don't know how they're going to measure the success. But yeah, I've also heard that they're talking already about making a new one.
Right. So. It does fall into that weird space that we have talked about on the show before. I think mostly we talked a lot about it with regard to the was the 2015 Ghostbusters film.
Right. Ghostbusters Answer the Call, as it was later resubtitled.
Indeed. That we both enjoyed for what it was. But depending on whether you felt a reboot with new characters of different genders, whether you thought that was offensive or not, people interpreted the numbers very differently.
Right.
We said, people saw the numbers, and since it wasn't as much as what Iron Man did, it was clearly a failure and a disaster of a film.
Right.
But compared to most other movies, it actually did very well. I think this movie kind of falls in the same, in the discourse, has fallen into some of that same trap, because there are people that are, as you were talking about, kind of offended that it's so goofy, that it's so light, that it's so kind of broad in terms of story and accessibility. And so anything they see, it means it's a failure, right? But so I'm not sure how to read the numbers. One, also because it's the first installment of what they're hoping is a new franchise. So it has nothing really to be compared against, I guess, aside from the last major fantasy film, which would be
Lord of the Rings.
Right? Or what? Popular fantasy.
It is tough, and I know they definitely want to, they want a franchise like everyone else, right? They've been pushing multiverse this, multiverse that, within D&D and also within Magic the Gathering. They want to get a money machine like they see Disney has. They want that money machine. I question the way they're chasing it, but hey, what am I? The Bank of America's rating guy who thinks that they're making poor short-term decisions or poor long-term decisions for short-term gain? No, I'm not that guy.
Well, you did used to work for a bank.
I did, but not Bank of America.
So of the two of us, you are more qualified. So yeah, I don't know. It's up to the studio, and they're in an interesting position because I don't know the kind of contracts they had these stars sign. I don't know if they signed on for multi-picture deals, but the nice thing about D&D and everything about it is that they don't have to use the same characters.
Yes,
for subsequent films or TV shows if they want to go multimodal with this property, like we're seeing with Transformers or Star Wars. And Marvel, of course, right?
Well, they actually announced a TV show, right?
Oh, they did.
A live action series was earlier this year. So yeah, it was right when they had one of their controversies. The OGL fiasco really blew up. It was 2 days later. They're like, and by the way, everybody, we've got a TV show on the way. So yeah, it's definitely a thing they're doing. And I do think that where they go with it will be interesting because there are a lot of stories. Now, here's the thing. A lot of those D&D stories, those novels and stuff, they are the serious kind. They are just kind of grinded out, pulp fantasy where, it's I mean, I've read a few of them. They're entirely forgettable for me. I just know that there were characters, and I sometimes remember their names.
Right.
But they have a lot of those, right? They have Dragonlance, which people go gaga over, which they made a movie out of, which was not successful.
Oh, no.
They've got Forgotten Realms, which we've now seen a movie set in. And they could continue, right, a TV show or a movie adjacent to this where you kind of now have a sense of, oh, yeah, okay. It's in the same world, right? It doesn't have to be a sequel, but like they could say something Neverwinter, and you're like, oh yeah, that was the place.
I think that the movie did a pretty good job with that sense of place, because they did go to a lot of places, and I think we saw maps at various points, and every place was distinct enough to be like, oh, this is an interesting setting, and so they've set up a good groundwork to have different stories take place in different places and still have it feel cohesive.
Which I think is probably the best thing they can do with that. Is just to have a world to move into. And then of course they're going to run afoul of, I think, the thing that a lot of these stories always do, which is, but is it a place to play games or is it a place to tell stories?
Right.
Which you can do both, but that always, it's like every time I try to play a Star Wars tabletop role-playing game, I run afoul of, well, that's not how it worked in the TV show, and you're like, well, we could make up our own, but then it gets weirder, right? Like, well, in our universe, Darth Vader didn't go to Rogue One or whatever. You're like, oh, okay, if it were, if a different group were in charge, I'd actually think that they could do some interesting things. I'm not really confident with Hasbro right now, because I do think that Hasbro, right, they seem like they're lurching more than they're making strategic decisions. And while they may lurch in the right direction on this, I also can entirely see them lurching in the entirely wrong direction, right? Like, just something heinous coming out of this where we're like, whoop, we're here to redeem Marlon Wayans.
They could hire Michael Bay to direct a franchise based on one of the most beloved properties in D&D, and then it's just a disaster until finally, nearly a decade later, they bring in a new director to do a prequel to actually redeem and show us the characters that we remember from our childhood on screen.
What could you be talking about? Dan, I don't know what you're going to be talking about. But also,
anyway, Transformers: Rise of the Beast coming soon.
I think the other thing that it'll be interesting to see how they compete with some of the other, the animated works, right? Like, Critical Role has 2 seasons of an animated show. And I can only imagine that they're slowly building their kind of machine to do more with it.
Right. And they're multimodal as well. They have obviously podcasts, they have streams, they have comic books, and probably novels at this point too, right? All based off of their stuff.
I think that's the thing that, while Dungeons and Dragons will always have their legacy stuff, and they're obviously able to make new stuff, that's why I think, like, this is Hasbro's game to fuck up. And, hey. Literally, yeah. That's their thing.
I think the biggest travesty would be is if not by now, if not within the end of the year, like a German power metal band hasn't started that's called Fat Dragon, then if that hasn't happened, then they've really fucked up.
We'll see. I was talking to a friend who was very excited to see the homage to the original animated Dungeons and Dragons series.
Yeah.
And my favorite response to that was I texted back to my friend, I'm like, well, did you see the Brazilian car commercial? And of course his response is question mark. And I'm like, and then all of a sudden, like 5 minutes later, he's like, oh my God, that was amazing.
Yeah.
Which for those who don't know, I forget what company is, but basically a car company selling cars in Brazil made a commercial for a car that featured people dressed up as the characters, like acting out the cartoon, but like in live action. And with the idea being that they eventually get in the car and drive to safety, and in fact drive back to Earth. And it's essentially the last episode of the Dungeons and Dragons cartoon is a car commercial. And it's like, anyway, so apparently at some point while driving home, they also got stuck in Forgotten Realms.
I remember some people worried about, because it had been hinted at that those characters in the original show would be not featured, but, addressed, for lack of a better word, in the movie, that the movie was actually going to be following that premise, in that Chris Pine and all the other cast are actually like transported in from our planet and have to live survive in the Forgotten Realms. Kind of glad they didn't go with that, because that's always not good.
Right. I do think, though, there's a missed opportunity for a post-credit sequence with just them sitting around a table.
Right? Like the Lego movie, right?
Right. I mean, but more just the idea of, like, it's not even relevant. It's just the post-credits, but then have it just be like, no, this is them playing D&D. And Hugh Grant is, like, the game master, and he's like, of course I'm the villain, right? But anyway, that's my the one thing they could have done better.
Call us, Hasbro. We got ideas. So if you, dear listeners, have any thoughts about the topics we discussed this week, feel free to leave your thoughts as comments on the page for this episode at forallintents.net.
You can also post your comments or engage in conversations with other listeners on our Facebook page.
You can find us on other social media, specifically the places that we frequent, which means you can find me on Instagram at dbethelcomics, and you can find Andrew on Mastodon at profounddark at dice.camp.
While you're at our website at forallintents.net, you can also take a look at our YouTube page, which you can get to by following the link in the corner that says YouTube. There you'll find this show simulcast in YouTube. Feel free to, if you are listening there, like and subscribe, or as the kids like to say, ring that bell.
We use 2 tracks of music for our show. One is called Disco Medusae, the other is called District 4, both written and performed by Kevin McLeod of the Clan McLeod, immortal swordsman, graph paper enthusiast, and musician extraordinaire.
You can find his music at incompetech.filmmusic.io, and that's all licensed under the Creative Commons 4.0 attribution license.
If you like the show and like to help us out, the best way to do so would be to subscribe to the show using whichever podcasting service you happen to use. What would help us out even more, though, would be to leave some sort of review on their store page. Whether a text review or using the proprietary metric will help spread the word to new potential listeners to the magic of algorithms. Now, you and I aren't Nintendo players.
We are not.
But a new Zelda game was released, Tears of the Kingdom. I'm not playing it, but I did go down a really upsetting and frustrating rabbit hole. Because someone mentioned somewhere about the timeline. I'm like, what timeline? And I went down the rabbit hole of Zelda timelines. And Jesus, that's a mess.
You saw the one that has the branch.
There's like 3 branches. Yes.
Well, there's the big branch apparently centered around Ocarina of Time, which then these spew into that one.
Depending on whether Ganon won or not, basically, and then he got sent back in time to warn Zelda, or he just went back in time and just disappeared, or Ganon won and life went to shit. And then it all perhaps convenes around the Breath of the Wild / Tears of the Kingdom. I don't know. But that's Nintendo doing a lot of backflips that it probably didn't need to do. I don't understand the compulsion. Well, I guess I do because nerds, and the internet. But like the compulsion is like, okay, so how do all the Mario games fit together? I'm like, they don't.
They don't. They're just
games, leave it. You jump and punch bricks.
When did Mario have time to go to the Olympics?
Mario 3 is just a play, bro. It's just a play.
It is, yeah. And as someone who obviously I'm a Star Trek person, so I totally get
But they do the thinking beforehand.
Right. Or they do at least
some.
They care about it. That's whereas like Mario, no, it's just a game where you jump and hit bricks with your head.
Right.
Or I guess your fist, I'm sorry.
But like the thing with Zelda also is like, okay, not only are we going to try to fit all these together, we're going to have branching timelines, but Zelda and Link, there's one born unto every generation, basically. It's Buffy the Vampire Slayer all of a sudden. Like, what is going on? But okay, sure, whatever. You know what? The thing that matters is if it's a good game or not. And if you are playing Tears of the Kingdom, I hope you're enjoying it, because I want people to play good video games.
Yeah, and hopefully, I've heard good things. Although also I heard some people say like, "What the hell is this?" So, who knows? I didn't play Breath of the Wild. Actually, I don't think I played a Zelda since A Link Between Worlds. So.
I have never played a 3D Zelda game nor a 3D Mario game, like officially 3D. Now I've played Mario games that have 3D
graphics, but 2D gameplay.
Right. Was it the New Super Mario Brothers? Is what it was called. But still, it's just Super Mario Brothers.
You did help me play Super Mario Galaxy.
I did.
Yeah, so
I wiggled the nunchuck around to collect stars. So never mind. You're right. I've played 3D Mario.
No, and I will say that's actually the thing for me that it's a turnoff, which is why I don't play them. I actually find that I like the 2D gameplay, which is why Link Between Worlds I think was the last one they did that was in the style of the Super Nintendo game. So, yeah. But, a lot of people like it, though, so good on them.
Heck yes. So, until you play a good video game, dear listeners, I'm D. Bethel.
And I'm Andrew Asplund.
And for all intents and purposes,
that was a podcast.
You're listening to the 14th Source for all geeky and nerdy news and discussion, which means that you're listening to a podcast.
For all intents and purposes.
I'm glad you could join us. I guess we could push that button. I'm pushing it.
Boom.
I need to put a new light bulb in my overhead light. One of them is out and is very sensual in here.
Yeah, I guess for me it's the fact that No, Glenn, what? No,
I want to talk to Dan. Have you started recording already?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, that's cool.
I was doing some searches to get the image to make the show card for this week's episode. Mm-hmm. And accidentally I accidentally typed in Dungeons and Grandmas. And
it's a real different show.
Very, very different. Let's make an episode.
Mm-hmm.
Let's make it hot. Let's make it steamy. Let's make it quick. What? You're listening to the 14th Source for all geek and nerd. No, let me make sure I'm still recording.
Oh, boy. I'm like, yes, Tam.